Welcome to the program and thanks for joining me. I'm Alex Rondinan and this is If History is Any Guide, the political and current affairs program on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. In this episode, I will be talking about one of the biggest weaknesses in New Atheism, which is its inability and perhaps even unwillingness to provide an adequate scientific explanation of the role that abstract ideas play in human affairs and human history. How do ideas affect what and how humans think, feel, and act? Is it even possible to test a certain body of ideas, like religious doctrine, and verify whether it plays a positive or negative role on humankind? Can New Atheism actually provide a theory or model which demonstrates its core claim that religion poisons the human mind and tricks us into committing horrible acts upon each other? So stick around. Throughout its history, New Atheism has been very good at collecting two pieces of data. On the one hand, documenting the various authoritarian, violent, cruel, and sadistic parts of religious doctrine in the form of the verses of the holy books or edicts from religious authorities. You can find no shortage of documents in religious canons across history, across the world, that promote murder, slaughter, mass destruction, child abuse, and rape. And on the other hand, New Atheists will document case studies of religiously based organizations or religiously minded individuals committing horrific and terrifying acts upon people, whether it be in the form of mass murder, terrorism, slavery, or sexual abuse. It's undeniable that these groups and individuals have a long, gruesome history of crimes to account for. Far too often, though, the New Atheists will just leave the matter at these two pieces of data, as if their work is completed and there's nothing more to say on the matter. They've won their case. Time to go home. But no matter how comprehensive the data they collect, no matter how colourful their rhetorical flourishes, no matter how strongly they tug at the emotional heartstrings, they haven't actually proven anything yet. So New Atheism hasn't actually provided us with the scientific evidence it needs to properly launch its case that religion is the key and singular bane on humankind, the delusion from which we must escape, the poison to which we must find the antidote. To be a proper scientist, it's not enough to simply collect data together. That's an important part of the job, true, but there's more to it than that. The next step has to be to construct a scientific, paradigmatic model which addresses the issue at hand, which is based upon the evidence that's been collected. This scientific model or theory will need to possess certain criteria. Firstly, it must be internally coherent and logically consistent. Second, it must be based upon a broad range of evidence rather than one source or non-factual forms of information. Thirdly, it must be able to account for and explain the past experimental results and data. And fourthly, it must be able to make reasonable predictions about the future which are testable and falsifiable. At best, you could say that New Atheism has been able to meet one of those criteria. They have their two pieces of data, and they do try to provide an explanation for the world based on the reasonable conclusions drawn from it. But this is often based on a knee-jerk first impression of the data, rather than detailed analysis and comprehension. They haven't actually done the hard work of constructing a scientific theory that can connect those data into an abstract model which explains this phenomenon in a comprehensive, rational, flexible, and contingent way. How can New Atheism be considered a legitimate political and philosophical way to understand the world when it doesn't meet the basic standards of scientific investigation and critique? Instead, What New Atheism tends to do is just beg the question. It will elude and hint and wink at an explanation for these two pieces of data, but won't go to the effort of actually explicitly and directly stating what it is. If you just look at their words literally and don't read between the lines, then you won't find any legitimate scientific explanation at all for what the role ideas play in human affairs, let alone why religious ideas in particular play a very damaging and negative role for humankind. It's only through drawing the general outline of a picture and asking its readers to colour in the spaces in between that the New Atheism ideology in a concrete form can be uncovered. If religions are filled with violent and destructive ideas, and religious people commit violent and destructive acts upon the world, then it seems reasonable to assume that the former causes the latter. Religious doctrines promote and encourage slaughter, destruction, and rape, and the audience of those ideas, the religious followers, then actively carry out those acts in order to fulfill the ideals and virtues of their religion. The horrific acts committed in the name of religion are always about believers trying to bring those abstract ideas into reality, because they have already been convinced of the rightness of those ideas through being a member of that religion. So, if we ridded the world of organised religion and religious ideas, then there'd be no more encouragement or endorsement of such horrific acts, and they would forthwith disappear from society. That, in its simplest and barest form, is what New Atheism wants to assert, which is the whole basis of their movement existing in the first place. It wants to suggest that religious ideas are the key source for human atrocities and miseries happening, and so it tries to present religious ideas as the prime cause for such horrible acts being committed. This is essentially a monocausal explanation, because the detailed complexity of human existence is reduced to there being just one crucial question: the poisonous religious ideas which promote and encourage horrific acts to be committed in its name. But nothing has been proved. Putting two pieces of information next to each other doesn't immediately imply a causality where one leads to and results in the other. In and of themselves, there is nothing that proves that religious ideas about violence and brutality causes religious acts of violence and brutality. So the notion that religion acts as an evil poison that infects the human mind and heart, causing us to commit these immoral actions, which we otherwise wouldn't if it weren't for religion, is not proven through the mere demonstration of the raw data. You need to provide an actual scientific theory or model to show that these horrifying ideas cause these horrifying acts, which New Atheism doesn't do. To demonstrate this point that I'm making, you could hypothetically put the two pieces of data the other way around, assert causality and leave the question begged, and come up with a whole new, different solution to the religious question. Humans are just naturally violent, cruel, and nasty creatures who love to murder, rape, and destroy. We do these horrible things simply because it's in our own wicked and evil nature. And religious ideas are simply the ex post facto attempt by theologians and philosophers to explain why humans are the way they are, and to provide some rational understanding or justification for these things we do. By looking at things this way, religion isn't what poisons humanity. Humanity is already poisonous, and religion is simply a quasi-scientific record of that poisonous over the course of history. You see what I did there? I used the two pieces of data provided to me by the New Atheists. I didn't offer an actual scientific explanation or model, just simply placed the two data next to each other and asserted a causality between them, and then allowed an immediate explanation to reveal itself to me. Now, would anyone in the New Atheist movement consider what I just did to be a genuine demonstration of science in action, or just a quasi-scientific piece of nonsense? Typically, Whenever there is a public televised debate between a new atheist and a religious apologist, the discussion will regress into the two parties simply throwing their core talking points back at one another without there being any intercourse or dialogue or actual argument. The new atheist will cite the passages in that person's holy book which advocate slaughter, torture, genocide, rape, and infanticide, and then they'll point to that religion's long history of committing those such acts of horrifying brutality. But then the religious person will employ the same trick, just in the opposite direction. They'll cite passages in their holy book which promote peace, charity, and brotherhood, and then mention the humanitarian and charitable acts that their religion's institutions do. Because both of their cases are to a certain extent true, and there's no way for either of them to disprove the claims of the other, the debate can never reach a fulfilling conclusion. The whole thing just hits a pathetic and meaningless stalemate, where both parties are simultaneously right and wrong. Unless there's a way to ascend beyond the terms of that discussion, to actually reach a higher plane of thinking so that greater, deeper truths can be discovered, there's never going to be a fulfilling resolution to that debate. No matter how many times it's replayed, no matter which figures from which side are chosen to be the representatives, no deeper truths will ever be uncovered. So this whole discussion about religion comes down to one major question. What is the relationship between abstract ideas, such as religious theology and doctrine, and human actions? And by human actions, I'm of course including all forms of political, social, and economic activities, from individual to group acts, to the forming of governments, political parties, and other organizations. Anything that involves humans making the conscious decision to do something is considered an action, no matter its scope or scale. The only reasonable and appropriate way to answer that question is, it's very complicated, and there's no easy answer to give one way or the other. Humans are too complex for there to be any kind of monocausal or immediately obvious explanation for why they decide to do one thing or another. There are all sorts of factors at play which will affect human decisions and actions, including cultural, social, political, economic, temporal, spatial. Sometimes different factors will mutually reinforce one another, and sometimes they will counterpose with each other. Certain factors will have more or less impact in different situations, and there's a permanent unstable flux between these factors having a major or minor role, or competing with each other for greater or lesser role at certain times and places. The mediation process, whereby these factors are resolved to a single conclusion, do I do X or Y or Z, is deeply complex and might only be relative to that specific person at that singular point in time and space. Both religious apologists and new atheists don't want to take into account these complicated nuances and multiplicity of variable factors. They want there to be a very simple one-to-one correlation between ideas and actions, the only difference being that an apologist wants to focus on the positive and humanitarian ideas and actions, while the new atheist wants to focus on the negative and inhumane. So if we are to think about a human being inside a religious institution coming into contact with certain theological doctrine ideas, and then they go out into the world and perform certain actions, our ability to scientifically comprehend this is very difficult and challenging. Unless we know the other factors at play in the mediation process, we can never be certain why this person decided to perform act A or B or C. We have to look at each individual tree and the forest overall and see how they relate and interact with each other. And even then, we can never know with 100% certainty why this person committed this act at this time and place. We will only ever be able to arrive at a reasonable and approximate understanding, giving us a strong but broad ballpark analysis. Even the relatively simple process whereby an individual human will make the decision to commit one action or another at a particular point in time and space is deeply complex, because as they're thinking about which route to take, their minds will be filled with thoughts, information, feelings, and then finally a decision will be reached and they will take an action. Why, when placed in an identical situation, would one police officer decide to fire their gun but another one doesn't? Why, when placed in an identical situation, would one Christian offer a busker some spare change but another one doesn't? And if we go beyond the relatively simple and go to something larger, with many more moving parts, with the span of large amounts of time and space, the mediation process will be thousands of times more difficult to grasp and understand. When we are dealing with historical events, we will never be able to find a totally satisfying and comprehensive answer to why this occurred then and there. Why did Israel attack and invade Egypt in 1956? Why did the Anglo-Boer War start in 1899? Why was McCarthyism launched at that time and place and occur in that manner? Sure, religion can play a very important role in explaining why any event occurred, but the other factors mentioned before are surely just as influential, if not more. This eventually reaches the point where considering religion in the isolated abstract form doesn't help whatsoever, and we can only see specific religious doctrines within specific historical and social circumstances to make any sense of them. It makes much more sense to see religion as a social and cultural phenomenon, rather than a theological and ecclesial one. So let me just give one example of what I'm talking about. Let's say you wanted to answer the question, why was the State of Israel founded? To answer this question fully and properly and comprehensively, we cannot provide any kind of monocausal solution, as if there was only one variable at play that made this event occur. And yet, the new atheists' overemphasis of religion would lead us directly down that route, to the assumption that Israel was created because, and only because, of Judaism. The Jewish idea of returning back to the Holy Land, to re-establish the Kingdom of Israel, and return back from exile after they had fled from the Romans 1,900 years ago. There is no doubt, of course, that religion played a substantial role in this event, and Israel owes a significant amount of its existence to Judaism. But to assume that it's the only factor would be utterly absurd. Just think for a moment of all the other factors, specific and contingent as they are, that need to be adequately considered and analysed as part of the mediation process for fully understanding the founding of Israel. There's the historical role that Jews have played in the medieval European economy. There's the rise of anti-Semitism in the 1880s and then again in the 1920s. There's the writings and activism of Theodor Herzl. There's the rise of the organised Zionist movement, with leaders such as David Ben-Gurion. There's the history of the Ottoman Empire's occupation of Palestine. There's the end of World War I, resulting in Britain taking over the land of Palestine, issuing the Balfour Declaration, and creating a colonial state known as Mandate Palestine. There's the UN deciding to partition the land between Palestine and Israel. And then there's the outcome of the 1947 and 1948 wars between the Palestinians domestically and the invading Arab armies. The creation of Israel was an economic, political, historical, and cultural event, not just a religious one. So to reduce the event to only being the outcome of religious ideas would be to display immense ignorance of historiography and the scientific method. If New Atheism wants to be taken seriously as a way to understand the world, then it has to answer this question. What exactly is the relationship between abstract ideas and human actions? How can we rationally and scientifically explain the relationship between, say, Christianity and the Ku Klux Klan, or Islam and the Islamic State, or Hinduism and the BJP? It is not scientific or rational to simply juxtapose these two phenomena and leave it at that, as if the relationship of causality between the two is self-evident. It is quite obvious that ideas do play some sort of role in affecting how humans behave and how historical events occur. No doubt we are heavily influenced by the ways we see the world, and abstract ideas, like philosophies and religions, happen to provide a coherent and unitary system for interpreting and understanding reality, which can then guide us in committing certain actions at certain places at certain times, be it charitable and hospitable, or gruesome and bloody. But what is exactly this relationship? How does it work? What factors or influences make one thing happen and not another? New atheism simply refuses to acknowledge, let alone address and answer, these types of questions which go to the very core of their politics and philosophy. The new atheists love to make the claim that religious ideas poison the human mind, which then makes us commit horrifying acts. But how does this work? How does religious ideas influence and affect human thinking, emotions, and decisions? What are the mechanisms or systems whereby a human under religious indoctrination will commit a certain action? The new atheists have never provided a coherent scientific model which can properly explain any of this. Every great philosopher and philosophical movement throughout history, from Hume to Hegel to Sartre to Freud, has been required to provide a detailed, comprehensive explanation for how they see their subject of study. This requires massive amounts of detailed scientific and philosophical analysis, which will eventually provide us with a large body of work and a testable scientific model. Instead, New atheism seems to rationally base itself on the belief that all of this is common sense, and so doesn't need to be explicitly stated. We all know that this is true, and you'd be blind not to see it, so there's no reason to actually set down on paper the details of how this explanation actually works. Obviously, the core reason why Islamic State was created, or why there are Christian anti-abortion terrorists, or why there's the Israeli occupation of Palestine, is that these things were all caused by the poison of religious ideas. Apart from being grossly arrogant and elitist, this attitude is totally unscientific. No scientist can simply look at the raw data and draw a conclusion about what it means, without providing a framework or model for explaining how their processing works and making sense of the information at hand. Equally, no scientist can simply provide evidence that an event is occurring without also offering an explanation for how and why. All the greatest scientific accomplishments in our history have involved rising above the raw data and finding a comprehensive and logical model which provides a way for us to better understand reality, nature, and ourselves. Charles Darwin didn't merely document the evidence that natural evolution was occurring, but then offered a model to explain why. The same goes for Isaac Newton, Copernicus, Niels Bohr, and every other major scientist across history. New atheists should stop boasting about how much they admire scientists and the scientific method and actually carry it out in their own political practice. And that's all the time we have for today. You've been listening to If History Is Any Guide, the political and current affairs program on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. I'm Alex Rondinan. Until next time, goodbye.